Hello and welcome to another painting video. In this video I'll be painting the Primarch of the 12th Legion, the Supreme Commander of the World Eaters, the favored son of Khorne.
Angron!
I'm sorry. Anyways, after painting almost 1500 points of World Eaters, it was a treat to finally start on this amazing model. I tried out some new techniques with oil paints that I've never done before, and I decided to give Angron the scenic base he deserves. Let's begin, shall we? So the model of Angron has a very cool tactical rock, but I wanted something bigger and have him surrounded by corpses. My first idea was to put him on a destroyed rhino, but I don't see Angron caring much for attacking vehicles. He wants to reap skulls and see blood. That's why I'm building the base here using thick cork coasters I got at the IKEA. Simply break them in pieces to build a mountain and glue everything together. I made sure the tactical rock could be placed on top. I then thought it was a good idea to pin Angron on the base. This will give the huge model a little bit more support. Simply drill a hole in his hooves and stick a metal wire in there with some superglue. Next, I went to town on carving the block of cork into a more natural looking mountain surface. I cut away quite a bit, but this made sure I had some room for the corpses surrounding Angron. I have printed a couple of corpses, and here I'm looking to see where I want them to go. I added links to these corpses in the description if you're interested in printing them as well. I added a surface of milliput to the mountain so I could basically squish two corpses on the side of the mountain. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to place them anywhere. And here we have the finished base. I stuck in a whole bunch of printed skulls and spikes to the mountain, added some gore to the corpses, and made sure the base looks cool and chaosy. I used a lot of different materials. Even added some texture paste to the surface at the end. After spraying the entire model black, I spray the skin and the wings with sword hilt burgundy from Two Thin Coats. I do a couple of passes to make sure the color is nice and crisp. With the burgundy as the base coat, I now spray Rakarth flesh on the skin. I do make sure there is a gradient running from the base of the tail to the tip. So I'm keeping the burgundy color on the tail and the extremities of the wingtips. This will make the model look a little bit more interesting. I shade the skin with Berserker Bloodshade. This will make all the details pop, and this is an important step for highlighting, which I'm about to do. I take Rakarth flesh and highlight the skin. I keep to the raised areas, leaving the shade in the recesses. I make two passes to make sure the Rakarth flesh looks opaque enough. Next, I make a mix of Rakarth flesh and Palace Wish flesh and further highlight the skin. Here I'm using a feathering motion to create some added texture to the skin. I personally like this rough way of layering. I highlight the skin again with Palace Wish flesh. Again, I use a feathering motion to try to hit the areas that would either be hit by light or I really want them to stand out. And now for something new. I mix two oil paints together, Burnt Umber and Rose Madder, and add a lot of White Spirit. What you see me applying here is very thick, and I actually switch to a more shade-like consistency later. I take a makeup brush with some White Spirit and gently remove the oil paint, leaving the oil in the recesses and smearing it out in some places. This wasn't really thought out, and it was an experiment, so I decided to add a magenta oil paint in the mix. Here the mixture is more of a wash, and it went in all the recesses nicely. And again, I take a brush with white spirit and smear out the oil paint and remove it. And here is where I really got happy with the result. With the magenta being smeared on the pale skin, it really looks like a sickly reddish skin. Here is the end result of my oil paint experiment, and I gotta say I'm very happy with the result. I'm definitely will be using oil paints more now. Curious to see if the same effect could be achieved on smaller models. Working with oil paint sounded a little daunting, but to be honest, it was actually quite easy. And because you can remove the paint with white spirit, it's very forgiving if you make a mistake. I actually went back and forth with the oil paints during my painting process because the oil paints stay usable and wet for a very long time. I left the wings and the tip of the tail as a gradient to burgundy. I will now highlight this with a mix of sword-hilt burgundy and Kislev flesh. I highlight again with a previous mix, but I add flayed one flesh to make the highlight look brighter. To add some more definition, I shade with Targor Raid Shade. And I bring back the highlight of Sword-hilt Burgundy, mixed with Kislev flesh and flayed one flesh. I made a mix of oils with burnt umber and magenta and covered the entire skin. And with white spirit, I removed the excess of the oils. The dark skin looks nicely blended with the lighter skin tone. This really gives a nice variety to the model and separates the wings from the skin a little bit more. Let's paint the wing membranes next. I make a mix of Shyish Purple, Black Templar and Contrast Medium and cover the entire membrane, both inside and out. The membranes are perfect for dry brushing. I dry brush with a mix of Nagaroth Night and Nightlord's Blue. I add another dry brush of Zerus Purple mixed with Stegadon Skill Green. This gives the dark membranes a really nice midnight blue sheen. I add a dry brush with a smaller brush. This time I use a mix of Genestealer Purple and Thunderhawk Blue. Finally, I add some small highlights with a mix of Slaanesh Grey and Blue Horror. I think you need to make these membranes darker when the skin of the model is so light as I did mine. Otherwise the entire model would have been just a blob of flesh, and that's more Nurgle's area, I think. Angron has his trademark armor. Let's paint some brass. I'll be using the same recipe as all my other World Eater models, but I will go over it once again, in case you haven't seen the other videos. First, I base coat the brass with Balthasar Gold. I layer on Runelord Brass and make a rough highlight on the brass. This adds some variation to the armor. I shade the brass with Seraphim Sepia, which gives it a nice warm tone. Next, I paint all the metal with Iron Warriors and shade it with Vallejo Black Wash. Now I'll be dry brushing Canoptech alloy on both the metal and the brass armor. Because of the size of the model, I think a dry brush is the way to go here. This will give a rough highlight, which in turn will make it look like there are some scratches and battle damage on the armor. I add some Dirty Down verdigris on the brass on several select places. The beauty of Dirty Down is that you can actually just remove any unwanted paint with a wet brush. This is looking very nice. I was tempted to give Angron white and brass armor like my berserkers, but decided against it. In the lore he is always shown with his brass armor. I did actually paint one of his shoulder pads. I wasn't sure if I'd use them because I love the look of his arms, but one shoulder pad and one bare arm is a bit of a fad here with the World Eaters, so I'm going for that. All the World Eater sigils I first paint with white scar, so that I can use some contrast paints. I first use Achillean green on the entire sigil. Then I use a Militarum green on the raised areas to make them look like a world instead of just one color. All the black hair and small details I paint with Black Templar. Highlight with Storm Vermin Fur. And highlight again with Dawnstone. Angron has those typical Chaos Space Marine tubes everywhere, and I like to make those look flashy. I paint them with Voluptuous Pink. Highlight them with Emperor's Children. Here I'm using a stippling motion to highlight. And highlight again with Fulgrim Pink. I bring the colors closer together by washing the tubes with Berserker Bloodshade. Afterwards, I come back with Black Templar to paint all the inner tubes showing through the fleshy bits. All the horns get a base coat of Incubi Darkness and a wash with Known Oil. Then comes a series of layers and highlights. The first layer is a mix of Incubi Darkness and Thunderhawk Blue. I then add Varisian Grey to the previous mix and layer again. And I end with a highlight of the previous mix, but with Ulthen Grey added. This gives the horns a icy blue look, which I think fits really well with the darkness of the wings. Also, because the model and base are festooned with skulls already, I thought it would be a bit boring if the horns were bone as well. All the leather straps are painted with a Dryad bark, shaded with Agrax Earth Shade, and given two highlights. First with Gorthor Brown, and second with Carrack Stone. I make a very rough highlight on the leather, so it looks like the leather has been damaged and worn. Of course, there are skulls in this model. I base coat them with Screaming Skull, shade them with Skeleton Horde, and highlight them back with Screaming Skull to get a nice bleached bone look. Now for some small details. I paint the eyes with white scar, and paint them again with Striking Scorpion Green. I also add this to the World Eaters logo to make it pop just a little bit more. I dot the eyes with white scar. And I shade some parts of the skin with Berserker Bloodshade, especially near the veins. It's time to paint a Daemon Sword. The blade gets a coat of Wild Rider Red. I needed about 4 coats to get a nice even coat. Next, I shade the blade with Keroberg Crimson, which creates the darkest parts for our glowing Daemon Sword. I layer on a mix of Wild Rider Red and Fire Dragon Bright. I use a stippling motion on large areas of the blade. Next, I layer on a mix of Fire Dragon Bright and Flesh Kids Yellow. I am focused on the edges to make it look like the blade is running hot, with the fury of Khorne, because why not, right? I keep stippling on highlights. This is a mix of Flesh Kids Yellow and Dorn Yellow. I usually go for this rough kind of highlighting as that is my personal preference, but I'd love to see someone do this with a more conventional gradient. Let's see how that looks. There's a final highlight of Dorn Yellow that I forgot to film, so enjoy this doodle I made of a classic Khorne Berserker. I've also been adding these different steps to Angron's face and other parts that would reflect some light from the blade. I now water down Evil Sunz Scarlet and glaze over these highlights to blend them a little bit more with the model. When I first saw the model, I was disappointed he had a Daemon Sword and not another chain axe. But I gotta say, this does add a lot to the model. You get some other colors in there and it makes the model stand out even more. Angron is mostly done. Let's take a look at his base. On the base, I first dry brush Ulthen Grey. It was already base coated with Rakarth Flesh, but I wanted a brighter coat for the contrast paint. I paint the base with Basilicanum Grey and dry brush with Administratum Grey. All the spikes I paint with Mournfang Brown. And I give the entire base a wash of Agrax Earthshade. I bring back a dry brush of Administratum Grey to lighten up the rocks. And I stipple on Troll Slayer Orange on the spikes. Finally, I add Iron Warriors on the spikes to make them look like rusty metal. Now to paint some quick Guardsmen. They're not really the focal point of this model, so I want to paint them as simple as possible. I paint all the khaki uniforms with Zendri Dust, the green armor with Castellan Green, and any leather with Thondia Brown. Next, I shade the entire Guardsman with Agrax Earthshade. And highlight the model with a dry brush of Dorn Yellow. I really like this paint. You can highlight anything with it and it's extremely useful to have in your collection. The Dead Space Marines will get a similar treatment. I first dry brush White Scar on the model because I need the base to be nice and bright. Then I add Imperial Fist contrast paint on the model. This kind of makes it look like I attacked it with a highlight marker though. I washed the model with Gore Guntra Fur, thinned down a lot with contrast medium. This really dulls down the bright yellow and makes it look much better. I highlight the armor with Dorn Yellow. Any metal parts on the gun I paint with Basilicanum Grey. And black parts are painted with Black Legion. After applying some decals, I use a sponge with Rhinox Hide to add some battle damage to the model. Next up is Gore. I added some gory stuff to the corpses with green stuff and milliput. I first base coat this with Voluptuous Pink and highlight with Emperor's Children. I add another highlight of Kislev Flesh and a final highlight of Flayed 1 Flesh to make that gore shine. I apply a watered down Blood for the Blood God on all the gore and model where I see fit. I also sponge on Blood for the Blood God to create a splatter effect. Angron doesn't kill very subtly, and I want these corpses to look very mangled. I keep adding Blood for the Blood God on corpses and the base. I create streaks of blood using a very old tattered brush to make random splatters. Of course, Angron needs some blood too. Especially the axe should be suitably gored up in my opinion. And I add some splatters to his armor. And here we have Angron on his scenic base, overlooking the battlefield and ready to jump in the nearest fray. It was quite daunting starting this model, but once I got the skin parts done, I was having a very good time painting this chap up. I definitely learned that working with oil paints is a great tool to have, and I want to experiment with it more now. Does this conclude my journey with the World Eaters? Nope. I still have a few models that I want to paint and are different enough to have their own video. First up is Karn the Betrayer. In the meantime, be sure to check out my Instagram where I post pictures of current projects and behind the scenes stuff. But for now, thanks for watching and Blood for the Blood God.